Jed Parker had lived his whole life on the wide, dry plains of Arizona. He wasn't a rich man by any means. His small wooden cabin, leaning a little to one side, sat near a dusty creek that rarely had more than a trickle of water. He had a few horses, a cow that gave just enough milk for him, and a small garden that struggled under the harsh sun. Most days, Jed barely had enough to eat. Still, he worked hard from sunrise to sunset, fixing fences, tending animals, and trying to keep his land from turning into nothing but dry dirt. Jed was known among the nearby settlers as a quiet, honest man. He didn't have much, but what he did have, he shared freely. He would lend a horse to a neighbor who had trouble, help mend a fence, or share what little food he had with someone in need. People respected him for it, even if they didn't always understand why a man with so little would be so generous. Jed didn't think about it much. It was just how he lived. One late afternoon, as the sun burned low in the sky, Jed rode his horse along a dry creek bed. The wind blew dust across the plains, and the heat made his shirt stick to his back. He was looking for firewood when he spotted something unusual. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or a pile of rocks, but as he got closer, he realized it was a man, lying face down on the dusty ground. His clothes were torn, his skin sunburned, and his body looked weak from hunger. Jed slowed his horse and called out softly, "Hey there, you need help?" The man lifted his head slightly, revealing dark, tired eyes. He didn't speak English, and Jed didn't know much of the Apache language, but he could see the pain in the man's eyes. Jed dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible so the man wouldn't feel threatened. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the last of his dried meat and some water he had saved for himself. "Here, eat this," Jed said, holding it out. The man hesitated, then took the food slowly, his hands shaking. Jed waited patiently as he ate, watching for any sign of danger. He knew that helping an Apache could make other settlers angry, or worse, put him at risk. But something inside him told him he couldn't leave the man to die. Once the man had eaten, Jed checked his wounds. He wasn't a doctor by any means, but he had learned enough from his mother as a child to clean cuts and bandage them. He tore strips of cloth from an old shirt and gently cleaned the scratches and bruises. The man winced, but didn't resist. Jed worked carefully, trying to make him comfortable. "You'll be all right," Jed said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "You need to rest." He gestured to a small, shaded spot under a mesquite tree. The man nodded slightly, and Jed helped him sit. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jed felt a strange mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he had done the right thing. Jed offered the man more water and some advice on how to stay hidden until he could get back on his feet. They couldn't talk much, but simple gestures and kind eyes communicated more than words. Jed sat nearby, keeping watch as the man rested, his mind wandering back to his own lonely life. He thought about how little he had and how often he worried about getting by. Yet somehow, he had the courage to help a stranger. Night fell, and the plains became quiet except for the distant howls of coyotes. Jed made a small fire and sat close, keeping it low so it wouldn't attract unwanted attention. The Apache man, though still weak, managed a faint smile. Jed smiled back. It was a small victory, but it felt important. The next morning, the man was a little stronger. Jed offered him more food and water, enough for him to make a slow journey back to his people. The man nodded, touched Jed's shoulder in a silent thank you, and slowly stood. He looked back at Jed, as if to say, "I will not forget this." Jed tipped his hat and nodded. Days passed. Jed went about his routine, tending to his land and animals, fixing fences, and struggling to make ends meet. Life was hard, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He didn't expect anything in return for helping the man. He had simply done what he believed was right. But unknown to Jed, the man he helped had returned to his tribe, and told them about the cowboy who had shown kindness when he needed it most. The Apaches, who had heard many stories of settlers who were cruel or afraid of them, were surprised. They spoke among themselves, wondering why a man with so little would risk his safety to help someone they considered an enemy. Jed had no idea that his simple act of mercy had begun to spread among people he had never met. He had no idea that one day, hundreds of Apaches would arrive at his doorstep not as enemies, but as friends, drawn by the story of his courage and compassion. For now, though, Jed was alone, working under the hot sun, thinking about the small victories and challenges of his daily life. He didn't seek glory, didn't look for recognition, and certainly didn't imagine the events that were about to change his life forever. As he repaired a fence that afternoon, he thought about the man he had helped. He wondered if he was safe, if he had enough food, if he had made it back to his people. Jed hoped he had, and without fully understanding why, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had done what he could, and sometimes that was enough. Little did Jed know, the plains had witnessed a story of kindness that would ripple far beyond his small cabin, teaching lessons of mercy, bravery, and humanity that no amount of wealth or power could match. The sun dipped low over the horizon, and Jed Parker, tired but satisfied, watched the orange light fade into the night sky, never imagining that soon his lonely life would be touched by the arrival of hundreds of strangers. Strangers who owed their lives to a cowboy who had nothing but his heart to give. A few days after helping the wounded Apache, Jed Parker was going about his usual chores. He fed the horses, milked his cow, and checked the fences along his small ranch. The sun was climbing high in the sky, and the wind carried dust across the dry plains. Jed had almost forgotten the man he had helped, though he hoped he had made it back safely to his people. Suddenly, Jed heard the distant sound of horses' hooves. At first, he thought it might be a group of settlers passing by, but as the sound grew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. His heart skipped a beat. Dozens of figures appeared on the horizon, moving in a long line across the dusty plains. As they came closer, Jed's eyes widened in shock. There were not dozens, they were hundreds. He could count at least 300 men, women, and even children. Jed's first thought was fear. He was a lone man with a small ranch and very little to defend himself. What could he do if these strangers were hostile? His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the cabin, but he stayed calm and held it loosely. There was something in the way they approached that didn't seem aggressive. As they came closer, Jed noticed the man he had helped among them. He was riding a horse, looking healthy and strong now. He waved toward Jed, and the crowd behind him followed. Jed felt a strange mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. He had never imagined that helping a single man would result in this. The leader, the man Jed had aided, rode forward and called something in his own language. Jed didn't understand the words, but the tone was friendly. The man gestured toward Jed, and then toward the gifts the tribe had brought. Bundles of dried meat, animal hides, tools, and blankets. Jed lowered his rifle and stepped forward cautiously. The man smiled and pointed at Jed, then at himself, and then gestured toward the food. Jed understood. They had come to thank him, to show respect for his kindness. At first, Jed felt awkward. He had given the man food and helped him heal, but he never expected anything in return, certainly not 300 strangers at his door. He took a deep breath, nodded, and walked toward them. His small cabin was not big enough to hold all of them, but the gesture was what mattered. The Apaches began to set up a small camp near his ranch. Some gathered firewood, while others unpacked the bundles of food and supplies they had brought. Jed watched, amazed, as these strangers treated him not as an enemy, but as a friend. They were careful not to overwhelm him or his property, showing respect for the land he had worked so hard to maintain. For several hours, Jed talked to the man he had helped. Though they spoke different languages, they communicated through gestures, smiles, and shared understanding. Jed offered water and some food, and the man motioned for the rest of his people to accept it as a gift. Jed realized that this simple act of sharing had built trust, stronger than any agreement or law could. Over the next few days, the Apaches helped Jed around his ranch. They mended fences, repaired the roof of his cabin, and helped with the animals. In return, Jed shared what little he had: milk from his cow, eggs from the hens, and stories of life on the plains. Children laughed as they chased each other near the creek, while adults worked quietly alongside Jed, learning from his skills and sharing their own knowledge of the land. Jed had never experienced anything like this before. People who had been considered enemies had become friends. They respected him, and he respected them. It was a lesson in trust, compassion, and understanding that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the plains, Jed sat by his small fire with the man he had first helped. They watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Jed thought about how his life had changed in just a few days. He had gone from being a lonely cowboy, struggling to survive, to being surrounded by friends who had come from far and wide to show gratitude. The man handed Jed a small bundle of dried meat and a carved piece of wood. Jed accepted it humbly. It wasn't the value of the gift that mattered, but the meaning behind it. The man pointed at Jed's chest, then gestured toward the sky, as if saying, "Your heart is good, and it will be remembered." Jed nodded, feeling a deep warmth inside. Word of Jed's kindness spread quickly. Other settlers and travelers who passed through the area heard of the cowboy who had risked everything to help a wounded man. They told stories of the Apaches who had come to thank him, of the friendship that had formed across cultures. Jed didn't seek attention, but he found himself respected and admired for his courage and compassion. As the weeks passed, the Apaches would visit Jed regularly. Sometimes they came for food or supplies, sometimes just for the company of a man who had shown them respect. They taught Jed new ways to hunt, gather, and survive in the harsh desert. Jed shared his own knowledge of cattle, farming, and the land. Together, they built a bond that went beyond words, a bond of trust and understanding. Jed began to realize that helping someone in need could have effects far greater than he had ever imagined. His small act of mercy had led to friendships, alliances, and a sense of community that he had never known. The plains, once lonely and harsh, felt alive with connection and purpose. One morning, Jed stood outside his cabin, watching the Apaches ride across the plains, and thought about how life could change with even the smallest gesture. He remembered the fear he had felt when he first helped the wounded man, and how that fear had turned into something beautiful, a lesson in bravery, compassion, and humanity. The Apaches, in turn, respected Jed for his honesty and kindness. They had seen many people who judged them without knowing them, but Jed had looked beyond fear and prejudice. He had acted with his heart, and in return, he had gained something far greater than wealth or power: friendship, trust, and respect. Years later, people would still tell the story of Jed Parker, the broke cowboy who fed a wounded Apache and found himself with 300 new friends. The story became a legend of the plains, not because of riches or battles, but because of the power of kindness. Jed never sought fame, and he never claimed to be a hero. He simply lived by a rule he had learned long ago: help when you can. As the sun set each evening, Jed would sit on the porch of his small cabin, watching the horses graze and the Apaches move across the plains. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that even the simplest act of mercy could change the course of lives. It could turn fear into friendship, loneliness into community, and strangers into family. Jed Parker's life had been ordinary in many ways, but that small act of courage had turned it into something extraordinary. The plains were vast and often harsh, but they were also full of wonder, friendship, and the quiet magic that comes when a person chooses compassion over fear. Jed had given what little he had, and in return, he had received something priceless, a story that would live on far beyond his own lifetime. And so, the cowboy with nothing but a kind heart continued his simple life on the Arizona plains, surrounded by friends who had once been strangers, living proof that one act of mercy could change the world around him.